because I don't have those tools. And I would be interested, in talking with psychologists or psychiatrists or, online virtual friends, someone throw up a video, send me some links, read some stuff, on how that might be done to remove that stigma. But the stigma it's a very visceral, painful, personal sort of feeling. So that's number 2. Okay. So to move on then. The next is 2 psychological criteria for limiting a person's right to suicide. Right? So assuming that this person has a right, and we recognize that despite the fact that an individual has a right to commit suicide, that the tension and contention arises insofar as that right obligates others, and though you may have a right, you in no sense have a right to obligate me to do something. How do we conceptualize limiting the mechanisms which would otherwise limit this individual's rights, right? So the first, and this is under 2 psychological criteria for limiting a person's right to suicide, the first is the act must be based on a realistic assessment of the situation, right? We want a realistic assessment. Right? The individual must have a realistic assessment of his life situation. Again, I can't get into this too much because it was written by a psychiatrist, and again, I don't have the formal training to delve into it from a therapeutic level, so I'm just going to look at it as a very analytic level. On an analytic level, there's more legitimacy for any number of reasons for an individual wanting to end his or her life because of, let's just say, terminal cancer. Very painful, debilitating, cancer, and an individual who wants to kill him or herself because, and this is not to demonize or make fun of, right? This is just, I want to give a completely antithetical example. Someone who believes that insofar as they kill themselves, they reach a transcendent plane of existence for whatever reason, right? There's stigmas attached to both, but the question is, what's more realistic? Obviously, this presupposes the idea of realistic assessment. There's philosophical problems here, which is why I said I'm not going to present this in terms of psychological or psychiatric, but in terms of philosophical, because the question is, who determines? Who determines this, right? Who determines? Who determines what realistic is? Is it realistic to say that there's at least the possibility to conceptualize the acceptability of an individual killing him or herself based on, stage 4 cancer, but to deny the realistic assessment insofar as an individual wants to kill themselves for some transcendental act? I think of Heaven's Gate or any of most of the cults that I've read on, and I've done a ton of cult reading, right? The idea that some of these cults, the more hardcore cults, end in mass suicide. Right? Everybody kills himself, including the leader and everyone. Right? How do we determine what's realistic or not? For me, from a philosophical standpoint, this becomes the idea of determining what's realistic becomes a slippery slope. Right? It becomes a slippery slope because if we entertain the idea of ascribing a realistic assessment to the physiological presence of pain, which in some senses can be identified simply and measured easily, but we deny realistic assessment based on, the attempt to reach a higher plane of existence via suicide, then, how do we, psychological, mental torment, where do we place that? There's an aspect of both psychiatry and psychology that still themselves elude sort of empirical verification, where, the psychological torment that an individual has. Does that get legitimation? If it does get legitimation, at what point do we lose legitimation, right? Meaning, if we grant legitimation in terms of biological, physiological determinants that justify an individual in exercising his or her right to commit an act of suicide? At what degree of separation from biological legitimation into psychological, into spiritual? At what point do we draw the line of demarcation, and who determines that? It's a lot of power to say that, okay, this is legit and this is not, right? So it becomes a bit of a slippery slope, right? So I'm presenting the information, but I'm also critiquing the information as I present it, because I want to do justice to a rigorous conceptual account of this, right? And allow you to make your own assessments. Number two, the degree of ambivalence regarding the act must be minimal, right? How ambivalent is the individual in terms of committing the act of suicide? So let me write that down and I'll explain, right? So what's the degree of ambivalence? Right? What's the degree of ambivalence? If the individual is completely dead step focused, intent on taking his or her life, there's probably never going to be that cry for help, quote unquote, cry for help. There's probably never going to be an account or indications that others can pick up on that the individual has already slated a date, or that the individual has already selected a time or a condition or a series of conditions that need to be satisfied, at which point he or she is going to take his or her life. If, however, there's some trepidation, if, however, there's some ambivalence, various degrees of it, there could be a cry for help. There could be an indication that the individual has, or potentially could have, right? The individual is potentially prone, is what the term is, right? How prone is this particular person, or this particular personality type? How prone is this individual to taking his or her life? And if there are means of intervening on behalf of the individual to limit, right, that's the point of this section, right, to limit that right, to try and dissuade the individual from taking his or her life, how do we go about doing that, right? Because one, where those indicators have been present, despite the fact that the individual says, no, I'm not interested in taking my life, but indicators are present that the individual potentially is conceptualizing or could be at least prone to taking their lives, how do we go about intervening? Because you have to recognize that the act of intervention limits one's rights to suicide, right? The act of intervention limits another person's right to suicide. And this could be problematic for a number of reasons, right? Institution comes and wants to Baker Act the individual, let's just say. What the hell is this about? Who told you that I was going to kill myself, you know? Or in the event that you didn't disclose it to anyone, or in the event that you do tell someone, and that insofar as you tell someone that you're in confidence that here's something that I'm conceptualizing, and now there's social stigma attached to that and ramifications, and you could potentially be institutionalized, then you, as the person who intended it, could look at the other individual as having betrayed your trust. And then if you exercise that right in the future and do kill yourself, now this person has to deal with the betrayal of your trust, which you could never get amends for because you've killed yourself, and the fact that you ended up taking your own life, right? It's a very, very emotionally, I mean, now that I'm lecturing on it and I'm saying it out loud and conceptualizing it in this level, because you think about this theoretically in your head, but it's not to this level of sort of specificity, you recognize the overwhelming emotional tension that's created in relationships, right? In relationships between the individual who has committed the act and the nexus of, you know, interpersonal and community and organizational connections that suffer, quote unquote, from the exercise of that right to suicide, right? In a purely symbolic interaction in this sense, right? So it's very, very difficult. So key, this is a direct quote, every person's perception is reality to him. every person